This is a video looking at the Channel Islands, as well as other islands of the English Channel, of the islands of Portland, Wight, and Purbeck, and the Iles Chausey between southern England and northern France. My name is Michelle Gibson. The Channel Islands are a group of islands off the coast of Normandy, a region in France named after the Normans, the Norse raiders, also known as Vikings, who appeared on the coast at the beginning of the 9th century and eventually settled the region according to our historical narrative. And considered remnants of the Duchy of Normandy with its beginnings in 911 AD, and even as recently as the late 1700s, the Channel Islands were dubbed the French Isles, this in spite of the Channel Islands having been governed as de facto possessions, we are told, in one form or another, of the Crown of England since 1066, the year when King William II of Normandy was said to have invaded and conquered England, and who became known to history as William the Conqueror. The Channel Islands are considered self-governing possessions of the British Crown, known as Crown dependencies, of which there are three, consisting of the Baileywick of Guernsey, the Baileywick of Jersey, and the Isle of Man in the Irish Sea between England and Ireland. The United Kingdom is responsible for the defense and international relations of the Crown dependencies, even though they are not considered part of the United Kingdom, the Commonwealth of Nations, or the European Union. The two bailiwicks of the Channel Islands are administered separately, with each having its own independent laws, elections, and representative bodies, and each of the islands of Alderney and Sark within the Baileywick of Guernsey has their own legislature. Four main islands clustered together yet separate. We are told the term Channel Islands began to be used around 1830, and it was in 1830 that the Island of Guernsey began production of copper coins denominated in doubles, issued in denominations of 1, 2, 4, and 8 doubles. And that, for example, coins of the French livre were legal tender on Guernsey until 1834, and that French francs were still used up until 1921. Both bailiwicks issue their own banknotes and coins, which circulate freely in all the islands, and postage stamps, which can only be used in their own bailiwicks. Both Jersey and Guernsey have become major offshore financial centers since the 1960s, in which they provide financial services to non-residents on a scale that is out of keeping with the size and financing of their domestic economies. It is important to note that Queen Victoria's reign began on June 20th of 1837, around the same time as the production of the Guernsey doubles, and lasted for almost 64 years until her death on January 22nd of 1901. Her reign was described as a period of cultural, industrial, political, scientific, and military change within the United Kingdom, and marked by a great expansion of the British Empire. I have been intrigued by the Channel Islands since I saw this map of Alderney Island and all of the forts on this little island. The islands in the Channel Island group consist of Alderney, Jersey, Guernsey, Herm, and Sark. This is what we are told about Alderney. It is the northernmost of the inhabited Channel Islands. Alderney is part of the Crown dependency of the Baileywick of Guernsey, along with the Channel Islands of Guernsey and Sark. A bailiwick is the area of a jurisdiction of a bailiff, the Chief Justice of the bailiwick. Alderney is the closest of the Channel Islands to both England and France, and is separated from the Cap du La Hague in France's Normandy region by the Alderney Race, described as a dangerous passage because of the strong currents that run through it. From this particular map, it certainly looks like there is more of Alderney Island below the water than above it. Before I start looking at what's found on Alderney, I want to share a comparison for similarity of appearance of what Alderney in the English Channel looks like from above on the left, with Shemya in the Bering Sea, one of the near islands, along with Attu and Agatu, the westernmost of the Aleutian Islands. As I start on this journey through the islands of the English Channel, I apologize in advance for any mispronunciation of place names here. I'm going to start on Alderney at Fort Gronie, located on the north-central shore of the island. Fort Gronie was said to be the first Victorian fort completed on Alderney, constructed between 1850 and 1853 to defend the harbor breakwater works, with 28 guns in 7 batteries. We are told that it was the French coup d'etat in 1851, followed by the crowning of Prince Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of Emperor Napoleon I, as Emperor Napoleon III in 1852, and subsequently the establishment of the Second French Empire that prompted the start of the defensive works. It was during the time of the Second French Empire, we are told, that the Grand Railway network came together in France, centering on Paris, and the time when Paris was rebuilt with broad boulevards, striking public buildings, and very attractive residential districts for upscale Parisians. Georges Eugene Haussmann was the prefect of the Seine, and was credited with the renovation of Paris as a vast public works program between 1853 and 1870, commissioned by Napoleon III. This photo was labeled as the destruction of Paris during the implementation of the Haussmann Plan, so this was said to be Paris before the Public Works Plan, and Paris after the Haussmann Plan. The Second French Empire ended with the defeat of Napoleon III's military forces in 1870 to the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War. This was said to be an illustration of Prussian troops marching past the Arc de Triomphe in Paris during the Franco-Prussian War. It was said that the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck manipulated the situation by dispatching the Ems telegram on July 14th of 1870, inciting the Second French Empire to declare war on the Kingdom of Prussia on July 19th of 1870. I thought it was important to include this information about the Second French Empire as what appears to be a connection to the mudflood reset, and how it was covered up in our historical narrative to explain the existence of the Old World architecture of heavy masonry. Now back to Alderney Island. Going east along the north coast of Alderney, we come to Bray Harbor, the main harbor on the north side of the island. The massive masonry breakwater of Bray Harbor was said to have been built between 1847 and 1864 to protect the Royal Navy ships in the harbor in the 19th century. Just east of and overlooking Bray Harbor is Fort Albert, said to have been built between 1856 and 1859 and named Fort Albert after Prince Albert's death in 1861. It was said to have been intended to be the strongest coastal defense work and to have acted as the main citadel if the island was ever overrun by enemy forces. East of Fort Albert, we come to Fort Chateau Alatak, described as the Victorian fort on the most northerly point on Alderney. It was said to have been completed by 1855 for the protection of the eastern arm of a breakwater that was never built and designed for 23 guns with accommodation for 128 men. Now it is privately owned and used to host part of the Arts Festival on Alderney. Next we come to Fort Corblett, spelled Corblets, now described as a highly rated Victorian fortress that has self-catering accommodations on site where people cook their own meals. The Alderney Lighthouse, also known as the Mannez, Mannez, and the Canard, Quesnard, Lighthouse, is adjacent to Fort Corblett. The Alderney Lighthouse was said to have been built out of granite in 1912 to protect shipping from the dangerous waters of the Alderney Race and the many rocks surrounding Alderney. Here's a picture of the sun coming up behind the Alderney Lighthouse, in direct alignment with it. This is a good place to mention that I have found such alignments with lighthouses in many other locations. While I do believe that lighthouses serve to guide ships through maritime passages for the original advanced civilization, I also think they were serving multiple purposes on the Earth's grid system, including, but not limited to, astronomical alignments. Unlike Fort Corblett, which was converted into a vacation accommodation, Fort Les Amours Florains, LeshommeuxFlorains, the next place we come to on the coast, is in ruins. It was said to have been completed in 1859 and designed for 67 officers and men and 7 guns. We are told it was the first fort to be abandoned because of its difficult location. Fort Canard is next on the coastline on the left, and when I saw it, I was immediately reminded of Fort Massachusetts on the right, located on Ship Island in Mississippi, part of the Gulf Island National Seashore of the Gulf of Mexico. Fort Canard was said to have been built and completed in 1855 as a defense against an attack from France, and Fort Massachusetts constructed between 1859 and 1866, following the War of 1812, as a coastal defense for New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. Fort Oumet Herbe, Houmet-Herbe, is next on the coast and is located on a tidal island that is accessible by a causeway at low tide, Even though there are no steps at the entrance to get into this fortification, we are told at one time there were 5 guns on 4 towers. Here's a view with Fort Herbe in the foreground in a geometric triangulated relationship with Fort Canard, the ruins of Les Aumaux Florins, and the Alderney Lighthouse. Now we come to what is called the Nunnery, located on Longest Bay on the southeast part of Alderney Island. The Nunnery is said to be the best preserved small Roman fort in Britain, and the first evidence of military construction on Alderney. We are told that it was originally built in the 4th century AD to defend Longest Bay and the nearby Roman settlement, now an archaeological site on what is called Longest Common. Archaeologists explain the deep ground covering the ancient stonework by saying that sand could have buried the island's first main settlement after its occupants moved to the main settlement of St. Anne, and sand blew in and buried everything under 3 to 4 feet or 1 to 1.22 meters of sand. Fort Ile-de-Raz, Ilederaz, is on an island in Longest Bay across from the Nunnery on the shore of the bay, which is accessible by a causeway at low tide. We are told 10 men manned 64 guns at this fort starting in 1859. Essex Castle was said to have originally been constructed by King Henry VIII between 1549 and 1554, said to have been unfinished because the work on the construction of it was stopped by Queen Mary, and turned into a private residence for a while. It was said to have been partially demolished in the 1840s and turned into a Victorian fortification. So here's where I find something interesting. Why aren't there any fortifications to be found on the southwestern end of the island between Essex Castle and Fort Clonkey? The island's main settlement, St. Anne, is completely exposed on this side. Fort Clonkey was also said to have been completed in 1855, and is also at the end of a causeway that floods at high tide, like Fort Ile-de-Raz and Fort Herbe. So what is it with all these tidal islands? A tidal island's existence depends on tidal action. It is connected to the mainland by a causeway that is exposed at low tide and submerged at high tide. Famous examples of tidal islands include St. Michael's Mount in Mounts Bay in Cornwall, England, and Mont Saint-Michel, a tidal island and mainland commune in France's Normandy region. Both St. Michael's Mount and Mont Saint-Michel are named for the Archangel Michael. I would love to know what the true significance was of these tidal islands. There are many more examples than the ones I have shared here. One last thing about Fort Clonkey I would like to mention before I move on to Fort Tourgis, Tourgis, is that like Fort Corblay, today Fort Clonkey is a self-serving accommodation for up to 13 people. Now we come to Fort Tourgis, said to have been completed in 1855 to accommodate 346 men and 33 guns and 5 batteries. The Cambridge Battery and Battery 3, part of the northern defenses of Fort Tourgis, was open to the public in recent years, and were adapted for use by the German forces during World War II. During that time, Alderney became one of the most heavily fortified sections of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, one of the largest building works of the 20th century. Fortifications built between 1942 and 1944 envisioned to make an Allied invasion of the Western European mainland from the sea impossible. The Atlantic Wall was said to have been an extensive system of coastal defenses built along the coast of continental Europe and Scandinavia. The Channel Islands were occupied by the German armed forces during the war from June 30th of 1940 to May 9th of 1945, and were the only part of the British Isles occupied by Germany. Alderney was the only Channel Island to be evacuated during World War II, with all of the islanders forced to evacuate in June of 1940. With Alderney emptied of inhabitants, the Germans proceeded to build 4 work camps. The Germans surrendered Alderney on May 16th of 1945, 8 days after the Allies accepted the unconditional surrender of the armed forces of Nazi Germany, and 7 days after the liberation of the Channel Islands of Guernsey and Jersey. The people of Alderney were able to return to the island in December of 1945 after the extensive cleanup needed after the German occupation and all that entailed. Even with cleanup, Alderney was said to have been found in rough shape, with houses derelict, forts damaged, and wooden structures that had been burned as fuel. Fort Plat Saline is shown on the Alderney Star Fort map between Fort Torges and Fort Doyle, but it doesn't appear to be there physically anymore, with its memory retained in the name of this beach. This is a close-up on Google Earth of the lone structure on the Plat Saline beach, and it could have been the Star Fort at one time, but it looks like it has been repurposed into something like a storage or parking area. Fort Doyle is the last fort on my Star Fort tour of Alderney, near my starting point of Fort Gronie. As is the case with Fort Plat Saline, I can't find much information about Fort Doyle either, but at least it is still standing. Alderney is not the only small island I have encountered with a high concentration of star forts. Fernando De Naronja, the name of the main island and its archipelago, is off the coast of Brazil, near the city of Natal. The main island has an area of 7.1 square miles, or 18.4 kilometers squared, and the archipelago's total area is 10 square miles, or 26 kilometers squared. So what I found out that is really interesting about Fernando de Naronja is that in its relatively small area, there were at least 8 star forts here at one time. Bermuda is another island that comes to mind that was chock full of star forts. This is a 1624 map of Bermuda, attributed to Captain John Smith of Jamestown, Virginia fame. I found that both Fernando de Naronja and Bermuda figure prominently on Earth's grid lines. I used this Google Earth screenshot on the left to orient myself to Alderney's location with respect to England and France. In order to match up Alderney's location with this map on the right, and to show what appears to be a triangulated relationship between these 3 places with a high concentration of star forts for their small sizes, there are other places with a high concentration of them, like they are some kind of energy nodal point on the Earth's grid system. And interesting places like Valletta and Malta, where there is a high concentration of star forts, were heavily bombed during World War II. And it was the same scenario with the attacks on star forts in the Strait of Dardanelles in Turkey during the Gallipoli campaign of World War I. Were these wars a cover for the intentional destruction of the infrastructure of the original ancient advanced Moorish civilization? And why is an area of military operations in wartime called a theater? Are they telling us something without telling us they are telling us? One more thing I'd like to bring up about Alderney is that it is home to the only working railway in the Channel Islands. Working railway on a 3 square mile or 8 kilometer squared island. The railway was said to have been built by the British government in the 1840s and first opened in 1847. Its original purpose, we are told, was to carry stone from Menai Quarry at the eastern end of the island to build the Breakwater in Bray Harbor and all of the Victorian-era forts. It runs for 2 miles or 3.2 kilometers following a coastal route from Menai Quarry to Bray Harbor, manned by volunteers for operation on summer weekends and bank holidays at the present time. There were 3 royal visits to Alderney by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in August of 1854, and the royal couple was said to have ridden on an Alderney railway car under a striped silk canopy, pulled by 2 black horses to the quarry before returning. 3 years earlier, in May of 1851, Queen Victoria opened the great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations, held in the Crystal Palace in London. I believe this was the official kickoff of the New World Order timeline, and that this one, and subsequent exhibitions, expositions, and world fairs, were showcasing the technology and architectural wonders of the original civilization before being hidden away or forever destroyed. All of this so-called Victorian construction of massive fortifications on Alderney was attributed to this time frame starting in the 1840s on through the 1850s. I definitely think all of this is connected to the reset timeline and new historical narrative. The Baileywick of Jersey is the largest of the Channel Islands. English is the main language, though some people still speak or understand Jarret, the local form of the Norman language, and looks very similar to modern French. We are told that the Nazi German occupation of Jersey started 1 week after the British government demilitarized the island for fearing for the safety of civilians should there be any conflict, and that on June 28th of 1940, the German Air Force bombed and machine-gunned multiple sites on the island, not knowing about the demilitarization, killing 10 people and wounding many more. The island of Jersey surrendered quickly after this initial attack by the Germans, and several days later, on July 1st, the island was occupied by German forces. During the years of German occupation, there was no news from the mainland because the Germans outlawed the use of radio sets and the use of cars for private purposes was forbidden. Jersey was said to have been converted into an impregnable fortress during the occupation, with hundreds of bunkers, anti-tank walls, railway systems, and tunnel systems built by thousands of slave workers from different countries through Organization Todt, a civilian and military engineering organization notorious for using forced labor. The Jersey Ward tunnels were said to have been built during this time by forced labor and intended as protection from invasion, serving as barracks and storage depots. Storage tunnels were said to have incorporated a 24-inch or 600mm gauge railway in a loop, running through the whole complex. This is the railway in tunnel HO2. The tunnels were said to have been dug into the sides of hills into solid rock, as seen with the entrance to HO19 under Pier Road in Jersey's capital, St. Hellyer. We are told this incredibly sophisticated tunnel system was built between 1941 and 1945, and that as the Germans faced defeat, Tunnel HO8 was put into use as an emergency hospital because conditions were so bad for them. We are told that all of the fortifications built around the island were part of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. While Organization Todt was said to have been named after its founder, Fritz Todt, Todt is also the German word for dead. Liberation Day was May 9th of 1945 and is celebrated annually on that day. Today, we are told, traces of Jersey's defenses and wartime occupation can be discovered at St. Owen's Bay and other places around the island. The Military Museum of the Channel Islands is housed in a bunker within Hitler's Atlantic Wall defense system at St. Owen's Bay. It is interesting to note this pyramidal shape at the northern tip of St. Owen's Bay. The only reason I had any idea that the Channel Islands were occupied during World War II was because of a masterpiece theater production called Island at War, which was released in the summer of 2004, about the fictionalized island of St. Gregory as a stand-in for events that took place on Jersey and Guernsey. I don't remember how much I watched of this series, but I do remember when it was being aired. Let's see what we find on Jersey when we take a look around the island today. The city of St. Hellyer is the capital of Jersey and the name of one of the 12 parishes of Jersey. These are administrative districts that all share access to the sea and share a name with their ancient parish churches. St. Hellyer, a 6th century ascetic hermit and martyred healing saint, is the patron saint of Jersey. When St. Hellyer came to Jersey looking for a suitable monastic spot, he settled on a place known as Hermitage Rock on a tidal island known as the Islet. This was said to be an 1872 photo of the Hermitage Rock, showing what appeared to be rail tracks of some kind at this location. This is the Breakwater, said to have been built in 1870, which connects Hermitage Rock with Elizabeth Castle, which has the appearance of a classic star fort. The Elizabeth Castle was said to have been built starting in the 1590s, and that Sir Walter Raleigh, the governor of Jersey between 1600 and 1603, named the castle after Queen Elizabeth I, the ruling monarch at the time. And the official residence of the governors of Jersey was said to have moved to Elizabeth Castle from Mont Orgueil, which was said to have been built starting in 1204 and completed in 1450. In looking around Jersey's capital city of St. Hellyer, these are some of the places I encountered. This is Hillgrove Street on the top left, also known as French Lane, circa 1936. The curvature of Hillgrove Street immediately brought to mind the Kasbah in Old Algiers in Algeria on the top right, the historic Stone Street in the financial district in Lower Manhattan, and the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, Scotland. These are just a few of countless examples I have found of this type of curvature in street and building layouts, demonstrating what appears to be a level of shared city planning in very diverse places that is inconsistent with what we have been taught. This is a 1967 photo of Fort Regent, high above St. Hellyer on Mont de la Ville, which was said to have been built between 1806 and 1814 as the island's main barracks and fortification. And 1967 was the year that the decision was made to develop Fort Regent into a leisure complex. Then there's what is called a 19th century obelisk at Library Place in St. Hellyer. Called the Le Sueur obelisk, it was said to have been erected by an unknown sculptor sometime between 1855 and 1863 to commemorate Peter Le Sueur, a respected constable who lived between 1811 and 1853. There is even a fountain at the base of the obelisk with a lion's head and water running into a granite basin. There is one more place on the island of Jersey that I would like to take a look at, the Royal Bay of Gruville. We are told that the Royal Bay of Gruville gained the royal in its name when it impressed Queen Victoria during her visit here in 1846. Mont Orgueil Castle, which I mentioned earlier, overlooks the Royal Bay of Gruville. The Parish of Greville is the location of La Hougue Bee, Jersey's most noted archaeological site. La Hougue Bee is a Neolithic chamber site. It dates back to about 3500 BC, and its entrance is aligned with the sunrise on the spring and fall equinox. This makes La Hougue Bee contemporaneous with the Grey Cairns of Campster in northern Scotland. Said to have been discovered in 1850 and excavated in 1865. This cairn is known as Campster Round. And this one is Campster Long. Also dating from this time period of roughly 5,000 plus years ago is the West Kennet Long Barrow in southern England's Avebury complex, also known to be a solar marker at the equinoxes, as well as with the Watson Brake Mounds in Richwood, Louisiana, near Monroe, and Poverty Point. Watson Brake is dated to 5,400 years ago and is considered the oldest earthwork mound complex in North America. Note the summer and winter solstice alignments depicted here in this diagram of Watson Brake. Jersey also has one of the highest ranges between low tide and high tide in the world, a massive bulge of water that moves backwards and forwards twice a day. I found this photo in reference to a rocky beach in the Royal Bay of Gruville, saying that it is underwater, as well as the tower, at high tide. There are two other places I know of from personal experience that have the extreme tidal ranges found in Jersey. One is the Minas Basin in Nova Scotia, an inlet of the Bay of Fundy, and the home of the most dramatic tidal change in the world, with tides rising and falling as much as 46 to 52 feet, or 14 to 16 meters. The other is the Cook Inlet, which stretches from the Gulf of Alaska to Anchorage in south-central Alaska. The Turnagain and Knik arms of the Cook Inlet boast the second highest tides in North America, after Minas Basin and the Bay of Fundy. Like with the many places I have researched, there is much more to find on Jersey, and I could stay here forever looking around and finding many interesting things to share, but I have a lot more ground to cover in the Channel Islands for the purpose of this video. I'm going to leave Jersey here and move on over to the island of Guernsey. The island of Guernsey has 10 parishes, districts that are administered by an elected council of 12, known as a douzaine, and 2 elected constables. The Welsh Saint Samson of Doyle is the patron saint of Guernsey, one of the 7 founder saints of Brittany. He was believed to have lived between 485 AD and 565 AD. St. Samson's, the oldest parish church in Guernsey, was said to stand near or on the place where St. Samson landed as a Christian missionary around 550 AD. Guernsey is roughly north of St. Malo, named after another of the 7 founder saints of Brittany, and is an historic port on the English Channel coast of the Brittany region of France. This is an old map of St. Malo showing the presence of several star forts here, as well as St. Malo being a star city. The Allies heavily bombarded St. Malo, which was garrisoned by German forces during World War II in 1944. A car ferry system from St. Malo serves St. Peter Port in Guernsey and St. Hellyer in Jersey, as well as the English cities of Portsmouth and Poole. St. Peter Port is the capital and main port of Guernsey. It is described as consisting mostly of steep, narrow streets and steps on the overlooking slopes. This is High Street in St. Peter Port on the left, looking much like the Hillgrove Street in St. Hellyer on Jersey on the right that I highlighted earlier in this video for similarity with streets in other cities around the world. Castle Cornet in St. Peter Port is located on a former tidal island in the Little Russell, a channel running between the Isle of Herm and Guernsey. We are told that it was originally built between 1206 and 1256, and that it became one of the breakwaters of St. Peter Port Harbor in 1859. The tidal island of Lehu, just off the west coast of Guernsey, is the furthest west of the Channel Islands. and is connected to Guernsey's Larue Headland by a stone causeway at low tide. La Bray Duval was a tidal channel that made La Clos Duval, the northern extremity of Guernsey, a tidal island, but it was said to have been drained and reclaimed by the British in 1806 as a defense measure. I find the high concentration of tidal islands that are accessible by causeways only at low tide, and all the tidal phenomena I have encountered thus far in the Channel Islands, to be extremely noteworthy. At the eastern end of the Bray Duval, in St. Sampson's Harbor, we find Vale Castle, said to be over 1,000 years old. I have a few more points to make about the Vale parish before going back to St. Peter Port. It is a location of a high concentration of ancient megalithic sites, including Le Dolmen de Dehus, said to have been first excavated between 1837 and 1848, what is called the Lavard Passage Grave, said to have been discovered in 1811 and dating back to somewhere between 4,000 and 2,500 years ago, as well as a number of what are called cistine circles, like La Plate Mer. Cistine circles are described as a small megalithic chamber enclosed within a small circular mound. The Loncresse area of Vale Parish also has 7 Guernsey loophole towers, of the 15 such towers said to have been built by the British on Guernsey between August of 1778 and March of 1779 to deter the French from attacking after they declared themselves allies of the Americans in the Revolutionary War. Back to St. Peter Port. Come to find out, the French author Victor Hugo, best known for his novels Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, bought a house in St. Peter Port when he was exiled from France between the years of 1850 and 1870, allegedly for declaring the Emperor Napoleon III a traitor for seizing complete power in 1851 and establishing an anti-parliamentary constitution. This was his home in St. Peter Port. Called the Hauteville House, it is utilized to house an honorary consul to the French Embassy in London, as well as the Victor Hugo Museum. We are told that this house was donated to the city of Paris by Victor Hugo's heirs in 1927, the centenary year of the literary genre of Romanticism in which Hugo wrote. It was said to have been built in the year of 1800 by an English privateer, and that Victor Hugo furnished and decorated it himself. The Candy Gardens are on the outskirts of St. Peter Port, said to have been established in 1894, and a rare surviving example of a Victorian public flower garden. The gardens are home to the Guernsey Museum, as well as a bronze statue of Queen Victoria in imperial regalia with an orb and scepter at the top of the gardens, and a statue of Victor Hugo that was unveiled in 1914. It was said to have been presented by the French government to Guernsey in gratitude for the hospitality shown to Victor Hugo during the years he lived there. I wonder if there is a Victoria-Victor connection on display here in the Candy Gardens, with physical representations of both the feminine and masculine form of the Latin word for victory. Like the island of Jersey, the island of Guernsey was demilitarized in June of 1940, including the suspension of the militia, and shortly thereafter the Germans occupied Guernsey from June of 1940 to May of 1945. We are told that a massive building program was instituted by the Germans, which saw the construction of tunnels, anti-tank seawalls, coastal casemates, artillery positions, artillery observation towers, and a mass of trenches, minefields, and barbed wire entanglements. These were said to have been built using the forced labor of Organisation Todt. Guernsey was liberated from the Germans on the same day as Jersey, on the 9th day of May in 1945, and along with Jersey celebrates that date every year as Liberation Day. The La Valette Underground Military Museum is set in a complex of air-conditioned tunnels said to have been built during Guernsey's occupation as a fuel storage facility for German U-boats. The museum features exhibitions, displays, and information about various military and occupation memorabilia. So we have tunnels in both Jersey and Guernsey, said to have been built by forced labor during World War II, as well as Hitler's Atlantic Wall, one of the largest building works of the 20th century, envisioned to make an Allied invasion of the Western European mainland from the sea impossible. We are also told that when the Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6 of 1944, known to us in history as D-Day, most of the coastal defenses there were stormed within hours. Something is not adding up here. All of these massive building projects for making an Allied invasion from the sea impossible amounted to absolutely nothing. Moving along to the next Channel island, the island of Herm is just east of Guernsey and part of the parish of St. Peter Port in the Baileywick of Guernsey. It is administered entirely by Guernsey, with its inhabitants being workers for the tourist industry and their families, and various tenants who rent the island. For its small size, there are a large number of what are called megalithic sites on Herm, including, but not limited to, the Grand Monceau, the Petit Monceau, and Robert's Cross. We are told that the first records of inhabitants of Herm are from the 6th century AD, when followers of Saint Tugwal, another of the 7 founder saints of Brittany, established Herm as a center of monastic activity. St. Tugwal's chapel on Herm is said to date from the 11th century, with the site being of religious significance since the 6th century. Herm appears to be a shortened form of the word hermit. A hermit or eremite is defined as a person who lives in seclusion from society, living an ascetic lifestyle across religious practices, including Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sufism, and Taoism. Many famous hermits and ascetics were sainted and known for special abilities. For example, Saint Teresa of Avila was said to levitate during raptures, which is practiced by Hindu and Tibetan yogis. Was the TV sitcom The Flying Nun from 1967 to 1970 actually telling us something? The Hermetic tradition represents a lineage of Gnosticism attributed to the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus. These are the 7 Hermetic laws from the Corpus Hermetica. So were the monks, we are told, that lived on the island of Herm Hermetic or Eremitic monks that were learning to access their cities, a Sanskrit word for human superpowers? Were all the monks and nuns in the world at one time seeking this knowledge, and we have been taught a different narrative about them to obscure this information about what human beings are capable of? Quarrying took place throughout the Channel Islands, and the small island of Herm was no exception, with the Herm Granite Company being formed in 1830. There is an obelisk on the northern end of the island of Herm, called the Pierre Aurat's obelisk. It was said to have been built in the 1800s as a navigational aid for fishermen after quarrymen removed a large tomb previously used by the fishermen for navigation. The German occupation of the Channel Islands, for all intents and purposes, bypassed Herm, which had relatively little use by the Germans during that time. Operation Huckaback was a British commando raid on Herm on the night of February 27th and 28th of 1943, purportedly to take prisoners and gain information about the situation in the occupied Channel Islands. We are told the commandos didn't find any signs of German occupation and left. Cars and bicycles are banned from Herm. ATVs and tractors are used for transport and luggage. This brings me to the Channel Island of Sark, with a population of somewhere around 500, its own set of laws based on Norman law, and its own parliament. It was a hereditary fiefdom, the central element of feudalism until 2008, at which time it became a fully elected legislature. Sark has the same ban on cars as Herm, however, bicycles are allowed, and taxis are horse-drawn carriages. The patron saint of Sark is Saint Magloire of Doyle, the nephew of Saint Samson of Doyle, the patron saint of Guernsey. He was credited with all kinds of miracles, including healing miracles, as well as miraculously saving people, even after death. Saint Magloire was said to have established a community of monks on Sark at the location of what is now a hotel called La Moinerie, meaning monastery, which is right next to La Seigneurie, the traditional residence of the seigneur or dame of Sark. Sark consists of 2 parts, Greater Sark and Little Sark, and they are connected by a causeway called La Coupe that is 328 feet or 100 meters long and 262 feet or 80 meters high. The highest point on Sark and in the Baileywick of Guernsey is called Le Melon, after a windmill located there that was said to have been built in 1571, the sails of which were said to have been removed during World War II. Sark was occupied by the Germans from July of 1940 to May 10th of 1945, liberated a full day after Jersey and Guernsey. We are told that British commandos raided the island several times, including Operation Basalt the night of October 3rd and 4th of 1942, where one German prisoner was captured, and Operation Hardtack, a series of raids in December of 1943, which were ended, we are told, because it caused the Germans to bring in reinforcements. Sark had a different experience than the other Channel Islands during German occupation because of the influence of Dame Sybil Hathaway, the hereditary ruler of the royal fief of Sark at the time. Apparently she had a way of controlling the situation for a better outcome for her people. Silver and galena, the natural mineral form of lead ore that is also an important source of silver, were mined historically on Little Sark. There are what are called chimneys found here, said to have been for the discharge of smoke from the coal boilers of the silver mines beneath them that were mined roughly between 1836 and 1847. There is a megalithic dolmen in the vicinity of the silver mines on Little Sark as well. I noticed on the map a place marked Old Fort, and when I searched for information about it, I found a reference to it describing it as a star-shaped earthwork fort above the narrow isthmus that joins Little Sark to Greater Sark. I looked on Google Earth, and there is a star shape still discernible in the landscape at the location shown on the map marked Old Fort. Now on to some of the other islands of the English Channel. The Isle of Portland is what is called a tide island in the English Channel, forming the southernmost point in England's Dorset County. It is 5 miles or 8 kilometers south of the resort town of Weymouth. On the top is a barrier beach called Chesel Beach, which connects the Isle of Portland to the mainland of England. And on the bottom is a similar-looking place I found when I was researching a circle alignment that begins and ends in Merida, Mexico, that goes through Wrangel Island that is located in the Arctic Sea between the Siberian Sea and the Chukchi Sea off the coast of northern Russia. It is called Cape Blossom on Wrangel Island. They tell us this is natural, but I really wonder about that. There are similar shaped shorelines all over the earth. Portland Harbor, located between the Isle of Portland and Weymouth, is considered one of the largest man-made harbors in the world. We are told that the Admiralty constructed the harbor as a facility for the Royal Navy, starting in 1849 and completing it in 1872. We are told that prior to the construction of the harbor, in the 16th century, King Henry VIII built Portland Castle on the island of Portland, and Sandsfoot Castle in Weymouth to defend the original harbor here against French and Spanish invaders, and which had been used as an anchorage for ships for centuries. We are told construction of the breakwaters of Portland Harbor started in 1849, with Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria, laying the foundation stone on June 25th of that year, and were completed in 1872. Still functioning as a prison, Her Majesty's Prison Portland was said to have been established in 1848 to provide convict labor to quarry the stone needed to construct the breakwaters and harbor defenses. We are told that the tremendous amount of stone needed for all of this construction was quarried by convicts starting in 1849 in the Admiralty Quarry, and that railways were built to accommodate the stone quarrying process. We are told the Admiralty Incline Railway was built in 1848 and 1849 in order to transport stone from the quarries to the harbor for the construction activity. When the Admiralty quarries completely closed in 1936, the Incline Railway's tracks were removed, and the Incline Railway was turned into a road leading into the naval dockyard, known today as Incline Road. Before the Admiralty Incline Railway's removal, it would have looked like the currently operating Lookout Mountain Incline Railway in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Also known as a funicular railway, it is a transportation system that uses cable-driven cars to connect points along a steep incline, using 2 counterbalanced cars connected to opposite ends of the same cable. As a matter of fact, the small Isle of Portland has quite a history with its railways, all of which no longer exist. The Merchants' Railway was said to be the earliest railway in Dorset, opening in 1826 as a horse-drawn first tramway, then Incline Railway, in order to transport heavy quarried stone from the northern region of Top Hill to Castletown on Portland Harbor, which is the location of Henry VIII's Portland Castle. In 1860, we are told, the horses were replaced with cables. The rails of the Merchants' Railway were finally removed for scrap in 1956, after the railway had fallen into disuse in 1939 with the increasing use of modern transport methods. The Portland Branch Railway consisted of two railways operated by different companies, although working as a continuous line. The Weymouth and Portland Railway was said to have been constructed between 1862 and 1864, and opening in 1865, connecting Weymouth and Easton on Portland. We are told the construction of the Easton and Church Hope Railway started in 1888 and opened to passenger traffic in September of 1902. There are a number of star forts on the island of Portland as well, like Verne Citadel, located on the highest point in Portland, and said to have been built as Portland's main defensive fortification between 1857 and 1861. In 1949, the citadel was turned into a prison and continues to be used in that capacity today. Located close to Verne Citadel, the Verne High-Angle Battery was said to have been built in 1892 to protect Portland Harbor, and a scheduled monument, which is a nationally important archaeological site or historic building, given protection against unauthorized change and is protected under the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act of 1979. A so-called Victorian-era construction protected under an act pertaining to ancient monuments and archaeological sites. My understanding is that the word ancient pertains to the very distant past, and not something that would have been built less than 200 years ago. The tracks seen at the battery were said to have been installed to move missiles. This battery has become a tourist attraction. Interestingly, there is a tunnel system at the Verne High-Angle Battery that also has tracks for rails. It was said to have been decommissioned as an artillery battery in 1906, only 14 years after it was constructed, due to the advent of smaller craft like torpedo boats. Apparently, the high angle at which the guns were placed were only effective with larger naval ships. The East Ware batteries are called 5 former gun batteries said to have been constructed starting in 1864, designated by letters A through E, and, we are told, built to protect Portland Harbor. Yet E Battery became a scheduled monument in 1973, and, like the Verne High-Angle Battery, is protected under the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act of 1979. The East Ware batteries of A and B are referred to by locals and urban explorers as the Forbidden City. Then there is Battery C and Battery D. There is officially no public access to any of the East Ware batteries. Other forts on the Isle of Portland include the Inner Pierhead Fort, located on the end of the Inner Breakwater next to the former dockyard of the naval base that was here, and said to have been built between 1859 and 1862. The Portland Breakwater Fort, said to have been built between 1868 and 1875 on the outer breakwater. Noath Fort in Weymouth, said to have been built as a coastal defense between 1860 and 1872. Upton Battery on the outskirts of Weymouth and northeast of Portland Harbor, described as a coastal artillery battery, said to have been built between 1901 and 1903 and decommissioned in 1956. And Blacknor Fort, located on the western end of Portland overlooking Lime Bay, and said to have been built between 1900 and 1902 and also decommissioned in 1956. The last place on the Isle of Portland that I would like to visit is called the Portland Bill. The Portland Bill is the southernmost point of England's Dorset County and is a narrow promontory at the southern end of the Isle of Portland. Features of the Portland Bill include Pulpit Rock, so named for the appearance of a Bible leaning on a pulpit, which to me looks like very ancient masonry, especially with the rectangular shape and straight edges of the Bible, among other things I see here. We are told that as a quarrying relic, Pulpit Rock is similar to Nicodemus Knob, a pillar within the former Admiralty Quarry, mentioned earlier as the quarry. We are told that 6 million tons of stone were removed between 1849 and 1872 to build the breakwaters and harbor defenses for Portland Harbor. The 22-foot or 7-meter-high Trinity Hill Obelisk was said to have been constructed in 1844 as a day mark or daytime navigational marker to warn ships off the coast of Portland Bill. Note the presence of old masonry blocks beside the obelisk. We are not taught about the advanced ancient civilization, so we don't see these stones as anything other than natural, when in actuality they have been worked and shaped. The Portland Bill Lighthouse is located right next to the Trinity House obelisk. The Portland Bill Lighthouse was said to have been built between 1903 and 1905. to replace two earlier lighthouses on Portland Bill, the old Hellyer Lighthouse and the old Lower Lighthouse, both said to have been originally built in 1716, rebuilt in 1869, and decommissioned after the Portland Bill Lighthouse became operational after it was completed in 1905. I have absolutely come to believe that lighthouses had a much bigger role to play in the original civilization than just navigational aids. Like always, there is much more to find on the Isle of Portland, but next I'm going to visit the Isle of Wight. The Isle of Wight is the largest island in England and its own ceremonial county. It is separated from the English mainland by a 20-mile or 32-kilometer-long strait known as the Solent. The Hurst Spit projects into the Solent Narrows and is the location of the Hurst Castle. Like Portland Castle, the Hurst Castle was said to have been built by King Henry VIII in the 16th century during the years between 1541 and 1544. It was said to have been part of a coastal protection program against invasion from France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. We are told that the Palmerston Forts on the Isle of Wight were a group of forts and associated structures that were built during the Victorian era in response to a perceived threat of French invasion. They are called the Palmerston Forts due to their association with Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister during that time, who was said to have promoted the idea. There were approximately 20 of these Palmerston structures along the west and east coast of the Isle of Wight. I'm going to just look into a few of them. Fort Victoria was said to have been built in the 1850s to guard the Solent. It is located on the Isle of Wight in a position opposite from Hurst Castle on the mainland's Hurst Spit, and overlooks the whole of the Needles Passage, the most westerly point of the Isle of Wight. More on the Needles shortly. We are told that Fort Victoria's military use came to an end in 1962 after having been a landing and storage point during both World Wars, and that the rear barracks blocks were demolished in 1969 to provide material for things like sea defenses. Today the fort is part of Fort Victoria Country Park. Fort Albert was said to have been constructed between 1853 and 1856 to defend Needles Passage from the possibility of French attack coming from Emperor Napoleon III. Fort Albert was said to have been rendered obsolete only 2 years later, in 1858, with the development of armored ships. Today it is a privately owned luxury apartment complex. The Needles are described as a row of 3 chalk stacks or pillars off the Isle of Wight's western extremity, and so named because of the former needle-like pillar called Lot's Wife, which was said to have collapsed in a storm in 1764. This is an illustration of the Needles, which includes Lot's Wife circa 1759. The Needles Lighthouse, standing 109 feet or 33 meters tall on the outermost of the chalk pillars, was said to have been built out of granite blocks in 1859 for Trinity House, the official authority for lighthouses in England, Wales, the Channel Islands, and Gibraltar. I find it interesting that the description in this photo says that the lighthouse is now flat-topped for helicopters to land. It's an active lighthouse and apparently needed underpinning work in 2010 to keep it from falling into the sea. What is described as the world's first long-distance radio signal was sent by Marconi from Alum Bay beside the Needles in the year 1897. I wonder what it was about this location that influenced his decision to do his work on wireless communication here. There is also a popular attraction called the Needles Chairlift, running from the top of the Alum Cliffs to the beach of Alum Bay below, with a great view of the Needles in the distance. I just found one answer to my question about what influenced Marconi's decision to do his wireless communication work here. Alum Bay sand includes extremely pure white silica, an important component for enhancing radio frequency transmission. There are 2 Palmerston Forts at the Needles. The old Needles Battery is situated on a chalk cliff located right above the chalk pillars. It was said to have been built between 1861 and 1863 as a coastal defense against a potential French invasion. The old Needles Battery has a tunnel leading to its searchlight emplacement in linear alignment with the Needles Lighthouse. I would love to know exactly how these function together in the Earth's original grid system. All the Earth's new controllers needed to do was stick a plaque on what looks to be an old searchlight naming contemporary builders, and what I believe to have been a common practice on infrastructure all over the earth to hide the Earth's true history. The Needles' new battery was said to have been completed in 1895, higher up on the same cliff, and said to have been constructed because of concerns about subsidence problems with the old battery and concussion from firing the battery's guns, causing the cliffs to crumble. The Isle of Purbeck is located between the Isle of Portland and the Isle of Wight. Though named an isle, it is called a peninsula as it is bordered by water on 3 sides. The Isle of Purbeck has significant deposits of what is known as Purbeck ball clay. Ball clay has extensive industrial uses, from tableware to wall and floor tiles, to spark plugs, to hoses, to pharmaceuticals, and kilns. Large-scale commercial extractions of the ball clay was said to have begun in the middle of the 18th century, with large quantities ordered in 1771 by Josiah Wedgwood, the English potter and founder of the Wedgwood Pottery Company, who became the world's first tycoon, leading to the construction, we are told, of Dorset's first railroad in 1806, known as the Middlebeer Plateway, and described as a horse-drawn tramway. This is where the Middlebeer Plateway was once upon a time, where it cut across Hartland Moor. As I find in many places, the memory of the original Moorish people is retained here in the name of the place. The cliffs on the Isle of Purbeck are considered among the most spectacular in England, and its landforms include the Durdle Door, which thought-provokingly aligns with the solstice. The last place I'm going to look at are the French Iles Chausey, the largest island group in Europe. The Iles Chausey are located in the Bay of Mont Saint-Michel, and like with many places I have looked at here, experiences a high range between high tide and low tide every day, with Mont Saint-Michel being a tidal island. The Iles Chausey are known for rocky protuberances that resemble something, like Elephant Rock. In case you might think this resemblance is a work of nature, check out this Elephant Rock on one of Iceland's small islands. Other named rocky protuberances in the Iles Chausey include the Monks and the Artichoke. Grand Isle is the largest of the Iles Chausey at about 1 mile or 1.5 kilometers long and less than a half mile or 0.5 kilometers wide, and the only inhabited island, where we find the Grand Isle Lighthouse, said to have been built in 1847, with the nearby Forteressa de Matignon, said to have been constructed in 1559 as a quadrangular fort. Another fort is Le Chateau Renault, the present fort of which was said to have been constructed in 1859 on the order of French Emperor Napoleon III and completed in 1866. It became known as the Chateau Renault after the automobile engineer Louis Renault purchased it in 1922 and restored it by 1924. La Semaphore of Grand Isle is a lighthouse on the highest point of Grand Isle, and said to have been built in 1867 and closed down in 1939. This is called La Pyramide on Grand Isle, and it still stands today. I'm going to end this video here. It is clear to me that the islands of the English Channel were a very powerful and significant place on the Earth's grid system, with all of the physical infrastructure found on these small islands.